Yuda Yaminase. Yedayet Nananunso Vase. I give thanks and praises to the Most High, first and foremost, and to the ancestors upon whose shoulders we stand. I have to give a big shout out to Proctor and the Proctor leaders who came up with this theme. I must admit that when I first saw the theme of truth-telling, moral reckoning, as if that wasn't enough, we added African spirituality to it. And once we did that, I knew that this was going to be an eschatological conversation. And so I hope that we're prepared for some apocalyptic revelations. And it seems like, considering what we've witnessed in the past hour or so, it's clear that that's what we're here to do. So I give thanks for that. I was born in New York to Ghanaian parents, from a royal family in Cape Coast in Ghana. And some of you may know about Cape Coast in Ghana. Cape Coast was the place, the dungeons in Cape Coast was the place where majority of the enslaved Africans were held during the Atlantic slave trade before they came to the New World. And when I moved to Ghana, at the age of 8, I learned a lot from my grandmother. Our family house is right next to the Cape Coast Castle. And I learned a lot about our own family history as it relates to slavery and colonization and our involvement in it. When I came back to America to continue my studies, in my African American history class, I noticed that the conversation or the story was a bit different from what I had heard from my grandmother. And I recognized that not only did I have a responsibility to get this narrative straight, but this responsibility also came with a sense of guilt. And I knew immediately that within this responsibility and guilt, there was a purpose. And the purpose was to make sure that one half of me reconciled with the other half. And this wasn't necessarily about just our redemption, but also the redemption of our ancestors as well. And so this is what led to my theological journey into Pan-Africanism. But before I go into what I really wanted to say, I first want to recognize that Pan-Africanism doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. And for that matter, liberation itself doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. And we have to reckon with that. Black church, black bodies, we've always had this kind of Pan-African ideal ever since we left the continent, from pre-Civil War leaders that first got to this continent into the diaspora, Nat Turner and David Walker, all of them, immediately they got here, they wanted to go back. They wanted to reconcile with the continent. They knew that they had to leave. When that didn't happen, they understood that our memory was most important. And as I'm saying this, I want us to think about maybe a verse or a chapter like Psalm 137, right? By the rivers of Babylon, where we wept when we remembered Zion. Captors asked, "Where's your God now? Our God cannot hear us because we're on foreign land." But if we ever forget where we came from, right? From that point on, generations after that, the foundations of the black church also was quite Pan-African in its ideals. But sometimes we may be motivated by the wrong reasons. So in that sense, the black church at that time, the foundations we're also about reconciling with the continent, but this time to go and Christianize it, right? Believing that this must have happened to us because our ancestors were backwards and primitive and weren't doing the right thing. So of course, we needed to go back to liberate them from their own ancestral traditions. That too is some sort of sense of Pan-Africanism, but again, motivated by the wrong reasons. As we move forward to even folks like early Du Bois and others who sort of had this mentality, to even some of our leaders that we speak about, who initially weren't Pan-African, but later on in their lives became Pan-African, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, others during the independence of Ghana, became Pan-African and began to be motivated by more of a social, political, and social economic possibilities of what Pan-Africanism could mean when we reconcile with the continent. And we've been sort of stuck in that space. What it means to reconcile with the continent. Ghana, as a nation, was a nation created to be a Pan-African nation. That was the ideals of Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, and hence the reason why every time the Pan-African spirit erupts, Ghana seems to be at the forefront of it. When I was thinking about a sort of Pan-African theology that dealt with, or at least had some spiritual implications, I wrote a proposal in 2016. It was written, but eventually in 2017, when we started to hear about the 400 years, the Ghana government decided to take this proposal and as soon as they got it, they sort of commercialized it. Initially, it wasn't supposed to be what it became. It was supposed to be a spiritual pilgrimage. In 2016, Godbox was created, and it wasn't supposed to be a travel and tour agency. It was supposed to be a one-time thing. The ideas of Pan-Africanism, of if indeed we were the children of God and we were coming together finally, reconciling, that this, again, had some spiritual implications. But I noticed very quickly that it wasn't just the Ghana government, it was us as well, and our mentality. Whatever we think about is what's going to manifest. Whatever we want is what we're going to see. And I think it was said that, the eyes will only be able to see what the mind can comprehend. So how are we dreaming? How are we imagining? How far can we get if we are indeed going to speak about African spirituality and what it means? I realized that majority of the folks that were coming in, we were still sort of stuck on the social political and the social economic possibilities. The spiritual aspects of it weren't really part of the conversation. We wanted land, housing, dual citizenship. These were the things that we were trying to come to the continent, reconcile with, and possess. And while all of this was going on, I was thinking about spirit and the ancestors. Far too often we're more concerned with our own liberation, forgetting that we have a responsibility to liberate the ancestors as well, who have been waiting for us. And so today, if we're speaking about the Spirit is asking us to do something. If we're going to speak about, if we have the gall to add African spirituality to truth-telling and moral reckoning, then the Spirit is asking us to do something, and clearly what it's asking us to do is to become spiritual in our thinking, that we can move away from sort of the promised land ideals of social, political, and social economic possession, And I think it's interesting that Sister Tiana was speaking about death, because once you start talking about spirituality, if we're going to tap into that, then we have to start thinking about the spiritual possibilities of being able to imagine a world without it. And in order to do that, we're going to have to get a bit uncomfortable. First thing we're going to have to do is separate the faith from the institution. That's something that, for some folks, may be hard to do away with. The faith, in essence, has nothing to do with the institution. The faith has always been African. And before people start walking out of here, I'm not asking us to leave Yeshua. Yeshua has always been African. I'm not asking us to leave the Bible. The Bible has always been in African history, but what I'm asking is for us to do away with hierarchy, with power, with authority, with dogma and doctrine. What's interesting is that we're not going to be able to have a real conversation about African spirituality within the institution of Christianity, because Christianity in its very foundations, very purpose was to do away with African spirituality. And so if we're going to move forward, we're going to have to realize that African spirituality and institution don't go together. This is why we have to move away. And it's going to challenge us, because there's only but so far you can go within the institution before it stops being Christian when it deals with African spirituality. And so we're going to have to be challenged. And how far are we willing to go with this African spirituality? How far are we willing to tap into the spirit? And I'm glad that the word justice is being used. Oftentimes we use that term quite loosely. Do we really understand what justice means to a people or for a people who have experienced such trauma, such destruction, what it means for their oppressors? And so I want us to begin to imagine something, and I'm gonna, since we're talking about storytelling, I'm gonna end with something real quick. When I returned back to Ghana after schooling here, I got to Cape Coast, and the chief of Cape Coast, my uncle, took me to the door of no return and poured some libation, asking the ancestors, or thanking the ancestors for bringing me back. During that time, after he poured the libation, as we were walking away from the water, I noticed that the water kept coming to my heel. Didn't matter how far we had walked, the water kept coming to my heel. And after the third or fourth time of it doing that, it started to get a bit weird. So I asked my uncle, do you realize that the water keeps coming to us? And he goes, oh, I forgot. Did you touch the water when we were doing the libation? I said, no. He said, that's why. The ancestors want you to touch them. So you have to go back. And so I went back, sort of weird, trying to figure out what this was all about. And as the water was coming, I touched the water. And when I touched the water immediately went all the way back, receded. And I stood there for about 5 minutes. My uncle was just standing there laughing, saying, you see, I told you the water wasn't going to come back after you touched it. And I immediately had an epiphany, a vision that if I can do something like this here, this could happen. I can only imagine if all our people return But it's really about the mentality that you have. What mentality are we using to come back? Are we seeking the social political and the social economic, or do we really want to tap into the spirit and understand that once you start speaking about spirit, there is no need to speak about the social political or the social economic. And this is going to challenge us, because indeed the rhetoric gives us purpose, gives us leaders, gives us power, gives us authority. But are we willing to give that up and have true liberation for our people? A liberation that doesn't end at the promised land, but ends back at the garden, right? Where we, once again, overcome death. That's what the Spirit seeks. And in order to do that, if we are going to return, first step is to buy maybe a one-way ticket. Thank you.